Hello and welcome to the Convey Culture podcast. We are already into season 2. It's an exciting time. Before we jump in, if you've liked the content that we've done in season 1 and into season 2, please like, subscribe, engage. Let us know how you're feeling, what topics are interesting. I feel like today's topic is one that comes up on every single podcast, and it's one that I feel like I think about maybe daily, and that is, what is it like to move abroad? And so part of this podcast today is I wanted to bring on a guest who's a true expert in this, who lives that life, who understands what it's like to be a digital nomad and can kind of guide us through those steps. So I have with me today the awesome Richelle from Move Abroad, a Move Abroad coach. Richelle, it's so nice to have you here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, the very first question I asked, because I want you to tell us about you, is what do you want a stranger to know about you? But more importantly, what are some important things about you and who you are and what you do, your culture and identity, all of it?
Yeah. So my name's Richelle. I'm originally from Seattle, but I've been living abroad for almost 11 years now. So yeah, a long time. So I started off in China. I lived in China for 5 years, and I've lived in Vietnam, Tanzania, Australia. My husband's Australian, and now the country of Georgia, not the state. Very confusing for people. But yeah, so I've been living in Georgia for about 4 years now. Just had a baby. She literally just turned 5 months today. So we took a little 5 month photos today. So yeah, I had a baby abroad, met my husband overseas, and living abroad for almost 11 years now. And so I have created a career where I help other people do this too. So I kind of started out, teaching abroad and working in the education industry and writing about my experience. And so many people were reaching out to me because I had a travel blog, which is a crappy travel blog. I'm just talking about my experience. And so many people were reaching out to me saying, like, how do I do this? Like, I really want to do what you're doing, but I'm worried about, and we can get into it today, a lot of things I'm worried about. And so I just started like coaching people for free via email, like creating guides, creating all this stuff to help people. And then I realized that me doing this in my spare time was never going to really get people where they needed to go. It was never going to really get people abroad. It wasn't really solving any of the problems. It was just kind of putting a Band-Aid on some of the little fears that would pop up. And then these people like wouldn't actually go. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to go all in. Like, I'm going to leave my job in China and really help people do this. And so, yeah, I've been doing this full time. I mean, I've been working on it for a few years, but full time for about the last 2.5 years. And I just love helping people create their own dream lives abroad. Like, whatever you want to do, like, I work with people to make it happen.
That's incredible, because I can't tell you how many times my friends and I will get together and have conversations about what would it be like to live overseas for a little bit, or what would it be like to just experience. And I think sometimes it comes off as something that's anti-American culture, but I think we've grown up in a society of a global digital environment where we get to experience culture at the touch of a button, right? So that encouragement to go see it in real life. What are some of the biggest fears you hear from people who are like, I want to go outside the country, I want to move abroad, but I am scared of X? Or
oh gosh, everything. But I would say, I like that you brought up the fears, because that's a lot of what's holding people back, because there's a lot of information, almost an overwhelming amount of information. But if it was just information, like, we would have already left, So a lot of times it's, what if I move abroad? It's always what if. What if I move abroad and I hate it? What if I move abroad and I leave my friends and family behind, and then I move abroad and I can't make new friends and then I'm lonely? What if I run out of money? What if, I lose my job and, then I come back home and I can't find a new one and then I'm homeless and then I don't have my health insurance anymore? And it's always what if this insert horrible thing happens. And so one of the things that I do with people when these fears pop up is sort of like a 3-step process, which is, okay, firstly, how do we make sure that doesn't happen? Like, what are some steps that we can take now to make sure that this thing that you're afraid of doesn't happen? Or what's some research we could do now to like appease ourselves? And then, okay, worst case scenario, it happens. Okay, then what? And a lot of times it's not actually that bad. You're like, oh, I would just do this. Okay. Problem solved.
You're all right,
and then, like, what are you going to tell yourself next time that fear pops up? Like, what are you going to kind of reframe in your brain and tell yourself, like, next time the fear takes over? Because it really is just like all those fears popping up. It's just that self-preservation instinct in your brain like trying to keep you safe, because anything outside of your comfort zone, it's scary. It feels like you're gonna get, attacked by like a lion or a bear, and you're like heart, same with like asking for a raise, your heart's beating, but you're not about to, be mauled by an animal. It's just like, but your brain just goes haywire, like, oh god. But a lot of times it's nothing like that, but it's our brain trying to keep us safe by keeping us stuck in what's comfortable. So like, what can we, that's why I'm always like, okay, thank you for trying to keep me safe, but like, I've researched this, I know what I'm doing, I'm not gonna like run out of money and be homeless, like got a cash cushion going, I'm gonna be fine. But sometimes our brains love to latch onto something as a reason not to go, and that's, it's just self-sabotage. And I mean that in the nicest way possible.
One thing I found is whenever I travel internationally, there is what I think are culturally responsible travelers who go somewhere and they respect the culture and they add to the economy and they're doing something that benefits. And then on the opposite side of that, there's culture vultures. So you can just tell come in and are potentially didn't do the steps you're talking about to be economically responsible and then they become a drain on that country or didn't. So how do you kind of help people to be culturally responsible travelers when they're thinking about going to another country?
I love that question, and it comes up a lot. Like, I think a lot of the people that I work with have, a fear of, well, I've heard that
Yes.
people in this country are upset at all these digital nomads coming in and, almost the opposite of what you said, splashing their money around and like ruining the local economy or something like that.
Right, that's true.
Yeah. And so if that's something that you're worried about, or you're worried about being a culture vulture, or you're worried about being like a drain on society and the resources, either way, like splashing too much money around, or, like having no money and like, begging on the side of the road, like whatever it is.
Or a drain, like there's got to be a happy medium in there, right?
Yeah. So if you're the type of person who is worried about that, then you're precisely the person who should be moving abroad. Like, if you are worried about that, then like,
Yeah, right.
good. Yeah. So there's a few things that we can do. Firstly, you can move to a country that's not as oversaturated, right?
Yes.
Like countries where you being there is actually a positive boost to the economy. So for example, like here in Georgia during COVID, like Georgia closed its borders, and then it was like a 2-week quarantine if you wanted to get in for quite a while. And so there were no tourists. So people like us, booking a wine tour or something like that because we still could, or, go like, shopping, paying rent. Like I pay rent to a local family here who needs the money. And I know that because sometimes they ask me for rent like a couple days early, stuff like that. Or like go shopping at the local fruit and veg shop. Like where I spread my money is much more local than like the average tourist. So, me living here, like I can take those USD because that's the currency that I make money in, but I'm spreading it not just in a concentrated like tourist sector. I'm spreading it like throughout the economy and just adding wealth in. Now, the main thing is if I'm adding wealth in, I don't want to just, completely disrupt the like the local market by like splashing money everywhere. Like I would rather, if I am doing well financially, I would rather use those savings to like for wealth creation or to invest in my retirement or my future. But yeah, I think if you're just conscious of like, what you're spending and what the going rate is, and you make an effort to spend local, like I think, as long as you're not going to a country that's like very oversaturated,
Right.
I think that you're, positively adding to society. And even in the countries that are a bit oversaturated, I would say, no offense to Airbnb, but like
Yeah.
things like Airbnb or something like that is negatively impacting the housing market a lot more than like, a couple thousand Americans like coming in, right? So
Right. It is sad. I know when you see the gentrification, we were just in Panama, and that was one of the arguments is Airbnbs are essentially, and we were staying in one, and you kind of have that moment of like, I'm not necessarily helping this economy by doing that. And so, and because the money isn't staying in those countries, the money is likely going back to someone else in the US. And so we have been trying to think a little more, be a little more
it's
cognizant
hard.
of like, where do I rent locally? How do I find somewhere that I feel like I can trust as well? And then if we're honest, you're a world traveler. How do you find the language barrier? How is that something that
Mm.
when you're navigating and
Yeah. I think personally, like I try to learn a bit of the language everywhere I go, even if I'm just like traveling for, a week or so. I try to at least learn like hello, goodbye, thank you, like those basics. But that is a big fear that I get from a lot of people is how can I move to this country if I'm not fluent in the language? And while I did like study Mandarin in school and like I do speak Chinese, so I can speak to that in terms of my friends, like them getting around in China. But even in a country that's very difficult like China, you can
yes,
still get around without being fluent in Mandarin. I would always recommend to people learn survival
yeah,
Chinese, aka like there's 20 25 little phrases that you can learn to make your life so much easier. But in a lot of countries you don't even need those 20 to 25 phrases to get started. Like China is a little bit more difficult than certain other countries. But like here in Georgia, a lot of people will speak English, especially the younger generation. The older generation mostly speaks Russian. But like I can get around even just through kind of basic sign language and a couple words here and there. Now, if you are going to live somewhere long term, I do recommend like learning some more of the language, which I'm trying to do with Georgian. It's really like I speak Mandarin. Georgian is hard. I'm trying. There's no Duolingo for Georgian,
yeah,
unfortunately. But but yeah, so I try to just encourage people to learn as much as they can. But you don't need to be fluent in a language before you get there or speak a ton of the language before you get there. Things like Duolingo are great to help, but just do your best and you'll be fine.
yeah. I
Yeah.
feel like people forget to just operate with respect. Like you are a guest
Yes.
in someone's country. If you operate with respect and say, I'm learning, like I'm still learning, here's what I know, I'm open to learning more. I feel like you are received with a much different energy than when you come with this frustration that you should be accommodated in someone else's country.
Yes. I love how you said that because sometimes there's this attitude of like, why don't you speak English? And it's not even always native English speakers. Like
No.
sometimes people who speak English as a second language will also sometimes have that attitude of like, well, I speak English. You should too. Like, kind of. So it's not just native English speakers who have that attitude, but I think it's worse when native
Mhm.
English speakers are like, why don't you speak English? Because it's like, well, why don't you speak a second language? Like,
Yeah,
geez,
it's like,
you know what I mean? But I like how you said I'm trying to remember the I am a guest because
yes.
that's exactly what I would do when I would have I would say China was probably the most difficult for this, and I did live there for like 5 years, but sometimes
Mhm.
I would just have like a bad China day,
Yes.
where I'm like, oh my God. It's just like one thing after another. Maybe I didn't get enough sleep. I'm getting on the subway to go to my job and it's just jam packed and somebody's listening to music out loud with no headphones in. And I'm just like, and then I get off the subway and everyone's cramming in as I'm like, just let me get out. And then like people are jostling me and banging into me. And I'm just like, I almost get a little ethnocentric for a second
Right.
where I'm like, if you would just do it properly and wait for me to get out before you get in. But let's be real, the doors are only open for like 2 seconds. If they don't get in, they gotta wait another 4 minutes for the next train. But I would get in that funk where I'd be like, oh, right? Why don't they do it my way? And then I would always pause for a second and be like, Richelle, you are a guest in this country.
Yes.
No one is forcing you to be here. You chose to be here. This is not your home. This is not
Mhm.
your culture. You're a guest. Like, be respectful. And
Get it
if you
together,
ever want to
right?
leave,
Yeah.
like, if you ever want to leave, you can leave. Like,
Right.
you're not stuck here. You chose to be here. And reframing that as a choice rather than as a like, I'm stuck here and it's
Right.
unfair and I'm angry. Like whenever I think of something as a choice and like remind myself like, hey, you're a guest, you chose to be here, then that's always a good reframe that I tell people when you're having like a
It's
cultural
just, yeah.
frustration.
I imagine you would. Like, there's times when you're sick. I always feel like navigating healthcare is when I've been in countries and we've had a medical thing and you're like trying to navigate healthcare. Although I
Mm-hmm.
have to say, I'm always incredibly impressed about the healthcare I experience in other countries, just
Mm-hmm.
how you're received. It's just very fascinating to me how America has such a specific culture, and then you go somewhere else and you are surprised by how safe you can actually feel. I think
Yes.
safe or well cared for or taken care of. And I think it's good. I highly recommend people travel. I'm like, travel. You either appreciate what you have here or you get a new perspective on the world. There's no
Mm-hmm.
negative that comes from travel, I think.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the healthcare thing because I worked a lot with people on that. I think that's one of the biggest fears, especially Americans have, is around healthcare abroad. Like, how good is the healthcare? How can I get my medications? What if I
Right.
have a health condition? What if I have a mental health condition? Like, how does that work? How does the insurance work? And there's this fear, and it's almost almost like a, I would say it's almost traumatic. Like
Yeah.
the fear that a lot of Americans have around healthcare, it just does not exist.
I
I don't want a blanket statement but pretty much it does not exist abroad. And I don't have to worry about it. Like, if I go into the doctor, I don't need to like panic call my insurance to make sure that it's covered. Like, I had my baby like abroad in Georgia. I'll just give you an example. I'm living in a post Soviet country, right? And like developing country. I decided to have my baby here. And when I was looking at different hospitals, I decided to go to like a luxury birthing suite where they have like a pull-out couch and like a private bathroom. I ended up having like not super an emergency, but like unplanned C-section. And like before I even booked with them, they gave me all the prices listed out on a piece of paper of what I would end up paying. And it ended up being less than I thought it would be. And I did the math and I did some research. And in 2023, off the top of my head, the average cost to give birth in the US with insurance, it was I think it was like $2,600, 2,000 something dollars, right? But
Right.
without insurance, it was 18,000 something dollars.
Insane.
Whew. Right. So with my insurance, firstly, is only like 30 something dollars a month, US. And so without insurance, I had a doctor, a midwife, a private birthing suite. I was in the hospital for 5 days, like Monday through Friday. I had an unplanned C-section and, of course, an epidural to make that happen. And like the whole thing without insurance was like $1,800, and with my insurance, it was like 1,400 ish. Yep.
I just,
So my insurance didn't cover that much, but I am only paying like $30 a month for it. So, but
but
yeah,
the cost of that, I mean, and you're right about Americans having trauma, because I remember for the longest time until my husband and I feel like got to a really stable financial place, anytime a kid got sick or a dental thing came up, I was like, oh my gosh, how is this? Like, you do get trauma in the US. And I think
how are
I've
we going to
friends
afford
who,
this?
yes, how are we going to afford this? And it will decimate you. They say a lot of the debt that
Mhm.
Americans have is medical debt and student loan debt, which both of which you could argue in certain ways are a necessity to be successful, in the United
Yeah.
States. So it's a hard place to be in. But
No.
I love that you brought up having a baby and raising a baby in another country. Now, Americans will hold very closely to like, this country is great, but when you talk about this country from the perspective of children, we have some real challenges. And so
Mhm.
some of the fears that we have here, you would not have abroad. So what was your kind of
Yes.
feeling about having a child abroad and like your feelings there as well?
Well, I think it helped that I knew some people who'd had kids here. Like, a lot of my friends were having their babies here. So I felt a little bit more peace with that, like just knowing people who'd gone through the process and had
Mhm.
really good things to say. I also hired an English speaking doula who knows the Georgia medical system really well. So, like, when things did go wrong, like, my doctor did speak English like pretty well,
Yeah.
but the nurses did not. And so when something was, when things were kind of going wrong, like, she could, sit with me and like explain to me what was happening and like walk
Right.
me
And be
through
your
the C-section
advocate. Yeah.
procedure. Yeah. So that was really amazing that I could afford that, because maybe I wouldn't have been able to afford that in the US. But also, after the baby is born, right? The childcare aspect. I have so many friends who have really struggled to find daycares. Like, you've got to apply for a daycare while you're like, you. I had a friend who told me that her office told her that she should, if she is even thinking about becoming pregnant, she should start applying for a daycare. And I was like, what? Like, some of the things I learned about the US having not lived there very like in forever. I'm like, wait,
It's
are you
crazy.
serious?
And even when you want childcare for a baby and your husband, you have to
Mhm.
get on a waiting list before this tiny human is even born, which
Before
is
you're
also
even
really
or
traumatic
before you're
because
even
you're like,
pregnant. Like,
yeah, it's like,
what?
what if this doesn't work out and you've got this unnamed human on a list waiting for someone else to take care of. It's the
And you've got
oddest
to like
thing
pay
here.
to apply, and
They
you got to
reply.
pay a bunch of different places. I was just shocked. Meanwhile, like, everyone here has a nanny usually, and then once they're a little bit older, they'll go to daycare. So how that it's been amazing for me to have I have a nanny that comes like 9 to 5, basically 5 days a week, so that I can work. And
Right.
so that's just been incredible because both my husband and I, we work from home. And so having her there to firstly like help me even during my maternity leave while I was recovering from my C-section. I could like barely get out of bed. Like having somebody to do the laundry or like watch her while I napped was just incredible. But then, after that, now that I'm back at work, like I just feel like my heart goes out to all the moms who have to send their newborn baby to daycare, a couple of weeks or a couple of months, like after the baby's been born. Like I can't even imagine, because right now, like I can just go out and see her anytime I want. Like I'm
Mhm.
breastfeeding. So, when she's hungry, unless I'm in the middle of a meeting, she'll come knock on the door and bring her in. And, it's just, and, I can be there. I can see how things are going. I could pick the person that I wanted, and it's affordable. And then also it's great to be able to like provide a salary for somebody as well.
I love that. And I just saw a stat, I think last week, that the cost of childcare in the US is about 36,000 a kid, which is overtaken what it costs per year on average to go to college. Insane. Like just the stat of that. And I'm not taking anything away from childcare providers in the US, because they also have to live and have a living
Yeah, of
wage.
course.
But just that combination of things, the math is tough here to
Maybe the
even get
government should
the
subsidize
net.
it like they do in other countries. Like, I don't know. Maybe there could be some help
And
there, but
right.
yeah.
And even gun violence, we talk about this a lot. Like the
Hmm.
idea that you in America, that's a reality, where in a lot of countries, that's not a
Hmm.
reality for school. That's not even a consideration in terms of
No.
something you'd worry about, not even just at school, but day to day. So do you feel, what countries have you felt the safest in, or what countries have you said, like, more people should know about this country and travel to them, and it's a beautiful place?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I would say honestly, like when people talk about safety, the most unsafe I've ever felt in my life, almost all of them have been in the US.
I know.
Like
I
I
know.
went to college in DC. Like I had some sketchy experiences there. Like walking home from work at night, like just at 5 o'clock, like
Yeah.
somebody trying to follow me home from work, like
Mhm.
in a nice neighborhood. I'm like, what? Right. I feel so much safer living abroad than I do back home, especially with the gun violence. And it's something that I didn't even realize. Like, of course I realized it was a thing, but
Right.
until you live abroad, it's the same as the healthcare. Until you live abroad, until you have that pressure taken off, you don't realize how the US is actually kind of scary. And
The
my
weight of
Australian
it.
husband, like he gets a little bit nervous like going to the movies or malls in the US. It just because he's heard so many stories of, mass shootings and things like that, where like guns are legal here in Georgia, but that's just not a thing, right?
Yeah.
Or in
Remember.
Australia, they had one really, really bad mass shooting, and their conservative government, like their version of the Republican Party,
Yeah.
they removed guns. Like you can still have like hunting rifles and things like that, but you can't just like it's not just everybody can have a gun,
It's
right?
not,
So
there's
they
no
they passed
regulation
some
for
gun
it, right?
reform, yeah.
And you see
So
that in a lot of countries, like
mhm.
Japan, you can technically have a gun, but the work you have to go to get one and to prove you're only using it for this means that you filter out the people who really aren't in any sort of capacity to have a firearm. And so you see more responsibility, I feel like, around some of the
Yeah, and I
weapons.
think
Mhm.
yeah, and just in terms of other safety as
Yeah.
well, like I talk about this a lot, how people, especially I did a lot of like solo travel before I met, my husband. I did a lot of backpacking, staying in hostels and stuff. And people would be worried about me. They'd say, "Oh, it's not safe for you to live abroad as a woman. It's not safe for you to travel as a woman." But I'm like, well, firstly, like the world is just a little bit inherently unsafe for women, like
Women,
in
yeah.
general. And so a lot of the precautions that I take abroad are exactly what I would do back home or less, right?
Right.
But I think the media tends to blow out of proportion how quote unquote unsafe other countries are compared to the US. Like the US has like there are a lot of countries that have travel advisory warnings for going to the US just
Yeah,
because of, gun violence, or like in, with Florida and like trans
right.
rights, they'd say, hey, be careful if you're going to Florida, or with the abortion bans,
Yes.
and if
With
you're
healthcare.
pregnant and have a miscarriage. When I was pregnant, I was like, oh my gosh, what if I have a miscarriage? Like I better be careful about like where I'm going, right?
Traveling.
But then like some backpacker is murdered in Thailand and it's all over the news for months. And then
Right.
people go, oh, they victim blame. They're like, what
Yeah.
what was she doing traveling solo? That's why you don't go to Thailand. Meanwhile, I say if every single woman who was murdered or killed in the US was on the news in that way, we'd never have anything else on the news.
We'd never travel. We'd never, you would stay in your homes. And so, yes,
Yeah.
it is. I do find this difference in, I would say, millennial and Gen Z and below and beyond, where I'm seeing this different mindset where I feel like since childhood, you've been exposed to a global environment, right? On social media, there's friends I have who live in completely other countries where I'm engaging with them or I'm seeing their life experiences. So, how do you think that's played a role in terms of like our generation's difference in how we see the world? Because I definitely think it's not an anti-American in any way, but it's definitely like I can travel other places, I can live anywhere. Do you see a generational difference in that kind of approach to global travel?
Yeah, I think, just being constantly surrounded by different ways of doing things through social media, through, our access to other people who live in the world. Like I'm seeing even, looking on TikTok and
Right.
people talking about their life in, Spain, and then people in the comments from the US being shocked, or people in Canada being like, yeah, I have a year off for maternity leave, and people in the US are like, what? Like screams in 2 weeks, right? So it's like, just just being able to have access to that, like I've had people tell me like, oh well, you help people leave the US, like if you really cared about the US you would stay, like that's so unpatriotic, you must hate the US. And I'm like, no, firstly, I don't hate the US at
No.
all. You can still vote when you live abroad, like I help people do that. I'm like, here's how you get registered, like here's, like, I'm from Washington State, they make it super easy, I can vote via
Yes.
email, like it's great. Some states make it easier than
Yeah,
others.
right. I love it.
Yeah, but I don't think it's unpatriotic to fight for positive change in what you want to see in your own country. So if you see, I've had people say to me like, oh well, you critique the US so much, like how unpatriotic is that, like stop, saying all these bad things about the US. I'm like, no, it's there are some I'm very glad that I have a US passport. Like I had a
Yeah,
lot of privileges growing up in the US that a lot of people don't get.
right.
Especially like native English speaker privilege is a huge thing. Like I got started teaching abroad, I would not have been able to teach abroad. There's only 7 countries that get to teach ESL in East Asia, no questions asked, and the US is one of them.
Yeah.
So like there's huge privileges that I get, but at the same time, like pointing out where there are flaws and other countries are doing it better is not patriotic. It's
No,
this unpatriotic. It's the same
right.
thing as if you want to level up as a person. Like surround yourself by people who are
Ooh,
doing what you want to do better than you, and you can, rise to the occasion. Like it's the same thing as like, hey, I want what's best for you, US. Here are
right.
some other country. I think saying like, oh, we're from the best country in the world, how amazing are we, we're number one. I'm like, number one at what?
Well, yeah, full claim. And also to me, it's also saying, like, I'm pro-immigration. I think if you follow whatever processes you
Mhm.
need and you get to live in our country, because I think about so many amazing contributions, quite frankly, that the US has from all the other countries. Like
Yeah.
our food, our culture, our education, even right now, honestly, our business and technology is heavily impacted by immigration. I mean, I saw this stat about the brain force of Nigerians coming into the US and how much they've impacted in a lot of ways. And so I'm pro immigration. And so I think if for the US, we even talk about where countries supposedly have open doors, it should be able to go back both ways, where you do go
Yeah.
to other countries and you experience culture and you add to their countries with the knowledge you've gotten here. So I I feel as though this idea of being number one, this isn't NFL football. There's no like winning thing. This is a global kind of pulse. We're humans. It's not us versus them. And so that mindset to me
Mhm.
is also what limits people from traveling or experiencing. It's
Yeah.
like I already live in the number one place. Oh my gosh, go see something you never imagined you could see in another country. Go try
You know
food.
what we
Go.
love? Like for the US, my Australian husband included, shopping, online shopping, great.
Yeah.
Probably number one, or maybe top five, right? But like, certain things, that I could get in the US are cheaper than what I would get here in Georgia because it's all imported. Like that, amazing. Like media and entertainment, amazing. Like there are certain things, national parks, beautiful. Like
Beautiful.
US has a lot of amazing things, but we're not number one in everything. So why not be open to other countries who are doing it better and learn something from them?
Learn. And evolve. I think to think
Yeah.
that you did something right in the 1800s, which they did, and then continue that through, like you're going to need to evolve your mindset around travel. What do you think, if you said like, here's some great countries to start out with, like how, actually, let me phrase that actually differently. When someone's stepping into this and they are not quite sure what they want to do you recommend just hopping and moving, or do you recommend kind of trying and traveling? What's your recommendation?
I think the interesting thing about this, which is maybe an annoying answer to this question, but what I love to do is just get to know that person and say, okay, so what is it that you really want?
Right.
Because some people, I talk with them and they think, oh, I need to pick a country, but I can't pick because there's all these countries that I want to see and I want to do this. And I'm like, well, you also said you wanted to you also said that you wanted to work remote. And you're not like moving abroad with like a ton of pets, right? So like, if that's what you want, like, then let's be a digital nomad. Let's move every few months. Like I've worked with people who are traveling the world, like house sitting other people's pets, where you get free housing in exchange for like watching someone's animals, and they're like seeing the whole world and not paying rent. But then I have other people who are like, the dream is this very specific country. Like I really want to go to Costa Rica, or I really want to go to Germany, or I really want to go to South Korea, like whatever it is, that's my dream. I'm like, okay, well then like, let's make it happen. But what I usually do with people is we use a combination of a few different things to create your own personalized plan. So what kind of lifestyle do you want? Do you want to like move around? Do you want to work remotely? Do you want a job on the ground? Do you want to stay in one place long term? Like how do you envision your life to look? And then like, how are we making money? Like what are you doing for work?
Right.
And then like, what country are you moving to? And consequently, what visa will you need to put all these pieces together? And then we put a date on the calendar, and we just have to make sure that everything matches. Right. So if you want to be like if you want to live long term, let's say, this comes up a lot for Japan, actually. I want to live long term in Japan, but I don't want to work on the ground. I want to work online, and I want to live in Japan. But Japan doesn't, well, now they have a 6-month digital nomad visa that's coming out. but they don't have like a year-long, like, especially in the past, they didn't have a visa for that. So it's like, okay, which of these pieces are most important to you? Is Japan the most important? Is living like long-term in one place and not moving around most important, or is working remotely most important? And then let's figure out what is actually the most important to you and create a plan that will actually work for you, rather than going, oh, well, I can't have what I thought, so I guess I just won't move abroad now, which happens all the time.
And you have a limited perspective too. Like you think you want that country, and it may be that you love Taiwan. I'm just throwing, you love another country when you're, and there's
I
other
do love Taiwan. Oh my God.
I have a couple on my list that I'm just like, oh, I've got to get to all of these. Do you find we've actually seen this shift with a lot of countries either opening up visas or kind of condensing their visas because it's been over. What are you seeing as some of the trends within that? Are countries wanting more workers to come? What are they seeing as like the trends around visas, or looking how they look at digital nomads?
Yeah, I would say the digital nomad visa is definitely on the rise. Like every single year, a couple new countries announce their visa. The annoying thing is it usually takes a couple of years to put it into place. Italy, but yeah, Spain, that creating, and if you don't know what digital nomad visa is, basically it's permission to work online and make your money from outside of that country and live in that country for a year or more. So for example, Estonia was the first country to do it. Like you're making USD, and you work online, but you can just live in Estonia for a year or more. But so many new countries are coming out with this, and I think it is a really happy medium of, we get the foreign money coming in, but it's not as concentrated in the tourist sector. It's not people aren't just spending it on hotels and tours. Like they're renting a place and going to the local restaurants and the local grocery store. So it's just spread out It's just more spread out, and then also not concentrated in one sector. And then people are staying there longer term, so it has less of like an impact as tourism. But I
Yeah,
have
it's
also
sort of ebb and
seen,
flow, yeah.
yeah, and I have also seen though that some countries that had like really open digital nomad visas, so for example, Portugal, they
Yes.
had this visa called the D7 visa that was supposed to be for passive income and retirees, but they were just giving it to anybody who worked remotely. And then that combined with their golden visa, where if you buy property, you can just live there. Those two combined basically just created this like huge flood of people that
Yeah.
came too fast. And
Yeah.
usually the issues that I see are was when too many people come too quickly, right?
Right.
Like it's not the amount of people, it's like a huge wave of people coming in a really small span of
Makes
time. Sort of
sense.
like when the war with Russia and Ukraine broke out, and so many Russians flooded into Georgia, and it was just out of control, and people's rents doubled overnight, and it was crazy, right? It's not, the problem wasn't that there were Russians here. The problem is that like too many came all at once.
Yeah, supply and demand is causing, yeah, that's what, that makes sense, that impact
Yeah.
that would have. Yeah.
So then you're seeing countries saying, okay, like let's split this type of visa up. So now you've got the
Right.
D7 and the D8. Like the D7 is that lower income, not lower income, but like the lower income requirement for passive income and retirees. And then the D8 is more of a traditional digital nomad visa where you're working and making a salary, and then you have to prove that you're making more money, right? Because it was
Right.
really low. It was like $700, $800 euros like per
Yeah.
month that you had to prove. That was too low. So I
Right.
am seeing that these digital nomad visas that are coming out, their minimum income requirement that you have to prove that you're making in order to actually get this visa, it's going up. So they're wanting people who are making like quote unquote decent money, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
To invest in the local economy.
That makes sense because you can't come and be a burden on this local economy. You need to come and be adding value to it as much as you can. I find that fascinating too because as we move into more and more of a digital environment, there's really countries have to adapt, right? As we move away from physical locations, it would make sense that they would start opening these visas. But I hadn't really thought about your point about so many coming at once because that is a very fair, and I actually think that's where you see my family's Costa Rican, and I think that is where you see the biggest impact to the local culture is when they come at once and it's almost like they gentrify an area because there wasn't any slow adaptation or there wasn't any, you weren't interwoven into the culture, you came in a flood
Yes.
and so you took over.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that's a really strong point about approaching kind of moving abroad too.
Yeah, and it feels a little uncomfortable as well. Like I know Mexico is one of those countries that
Yes.
can be potentially a little oversaturated in certain areas. But my husband and I were looking at potentially moving there, and then I found out I was pregnant. We're like, oh, I guess we'll put that off. But we were looking at a couple of spots, and I'd heard such good things about Playa del Carmen, and we knew so many people live there, so like let's go check it out. But it seems like a lot of the people who are living there, they're living like right in that touristy, kind of area of Fifth Avenue and the beach. And I'm walking around and everyone's speaking English. And it just sort of felt like, like the Hard Rock Cafe and like and the Vegas Strip like had a baby, and I'm like, what is this? And my husband has a Seahawks hat that he just has because it's like a cute hat, and then people are like, oh, Seattle Seahawks, and I'm just like, oh no, what am I doing? What am I doing here? Like, oh jeez, why is it like, especially because I'm not used to living in countries where like the majority of the the foreign population are Americans, so I was just like, oh my god, what am I doing? What have I done?
No, this isn't
And
what
I just
I don't
couldn't
want
deal.
that. You're like, I'm not
Yeah.
coming for America 2.0. I'm coming
No.
for your country and your culture. Yeah, I've seen that. I felt that in Costa Rica a lot when it's going over the different years. When I've gone, there's an area that's like a surfer town, and I'm like, I could be in California and San Diego.
Yeah, like what happened?
What happened here? So that's that is, I think, when you talk about the downsides of it and how can we be more culturally responsible travelers, like the country's job is not to adapt to you, like remembering that.
And if the country wants to adapt themselves because it's good business, or
Yeah.
because I'm friends with, I don't know if you've heard of Adventurous Kate. She's a travel blogger, but she
Yeah.
lives in Czech Republic, and people are saying, oh, I miss the old Prague, and there's too many like non-Czech restaurants now and cafes. And she's like, no, all my friends here, they want Chinese food. They want, Italian pizza. Like, they want the good cafe. They want this. So like, don't tell them they're not allowed to have it. But the problem is when you show up and you're like, why don't you have
Why don't you
pizza?
have this? Or I want this thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is.
Although I will say that if somebody wanted to open up like a Sichuan restaurant that serves malatong in I wouldn't.
Mad about it.
My favorite Chinese food. If somebody wanted to open that up, cough cough, I wouldn't.
No,
I wouldn't complain.
that is funny when you're somewhere and you think about. I know a lot of times when military families travel, they're like, send back Chick-fil-A, or there's some like thing that just anchors them to one food. So it is fascinating to see what people miss the most when they travel.
For me, it's Chinese food. It's like malatong is my specific dish from China that I like can't live without. So I'm very excited to be going to Australia in a couple months because I know that I can get it in Sydney.
You're like the food craving.
Yeah.
It's so funny how we're so attached to food and cultural and home. It's really fascinating to watch. Like, I watched this, I will put his name down later in it because I forgot, but he travels a lot and he's like, I have to have rice. So if I travel to a country without rice, I just need, like, after 4 days, I'm like, I have to get rice. And I feel him on that. I'm like, is there I can't do potatoes the whole time. All right. This has been great. Let me do rapid fire. And then we'll give a chance more for you to talk about how people can find you and connect. Actually, before we jump into rapid fire, is there any like stories or a moment that you've had that kind of reaffirmed that you were on this right journey? Like, this is the life I want to be on, or even an experience you've had with a client where you're like, this is amazing. Their life is changing.
That's a really great question. I'm trying to think of I have lots of stories. I'm trying to think of a specific one, but I think there was one that I wanted to tell earlier, so I might tell that one about healthcare, if that sounds interesting for people. And it's, so when I talk about like universal healthcare back in the US, and people like my parents' friends are like, that's not possible. I'm like, why not? But one story that I like to tell is, I've mentioned that, I'm living in a developing country where, sometimes we lose water for a day, or like electricity sometimes. And the infrastructure isn't like quite there. And like the country of Georgia is small, like it's smaller than the state of Georgia, both in size and population. And we all know, or like people talk about how, having universal healthcare is actually easier, like the larger your country is or the bigger your population is. So I was having a really stressful time period where I was trying to get my own coaching business off the ground, but I was still freelancing for someone else. And I was like letting their stress affect me. Work-life balance problems. I was letting their stress affect, like, she was based in Australia, and I would like wake up to just a million messages because she was doing like a big launch and was panicked. And I was just letting it affect me. And so one night in the middle of the night, like my chest is hurting really bad. And I'm doing all this stuff. I cannot get it to stop. And I start getting scared because I know that heart attacks in women are different than men. And I'm like, oh my God, am I having a heart attack? Like, nothing I'm doing is fixing it. And so I didn't know what to do. So we called our insurance, and I was like, where's the nearest hospital? Like, what should I do? Because I just never thought about it. And they were like, oh, well, we'll send an ambulance to your house. And I was like, oh God, how much is that? I turned to my husband and I was like, well, it can't be that much, right? Like, we're in Georgia, like it's not going to bankrupt me, right? So we're like, okay, all right, like it can't be that bad. So I get all, like, I put my sweatpants on and my shoes, and I'm like standing there with my passport, like ready to go. And, within 15 minutes, this ambulance shows up at my house, somehow finds my front door, even though Georgian addresses are difficult to navigate, finds my front door and comes in and starts checking me in my living room. And I'm like, oh, okay. And he's like, no, it's not your heart. It's from your stomach. So I'm like, okay, it must be like really severe, like heartburn or something, like acid reflux. And so he's like, okay, I'm going to give you a shot. And so they give me this shot in like my upper butt in the kitchen. And I'm like, okay. And so he's like, this should make you feel better soon. I'm like, okay. So then I start getting my stuff together, and I'm like, okay, we going to the hospital? And he's like, no, like that'll fix you. So
let's stay here. No.
Oh, okay. So we don't have to go. And he's like, no, wait 5 minutes, make sure you're good to go. And I was already feeling better. And I was like, oh, okay. So you just treated me here. And he's like, yeah. And then they start packing up. And I'm like, oh, wait, do you need my passport? Like, how much is it? Like, how do I pay you? And he just laughed at me and he's like, it's free, and then left.
I can't even. You're probably
Didn't
talking
ask.
about $4,000 or $5,000, and you're getting a ride, and they're not treating you. You're getting a ride to the hospital. Like,
I didn't even go to the hospital. I didn't have to wait in a waiting. I literally waited 15 minutes from the time I called to the time they showed up. It was free. They did not, keep in mind, I'm not a resident. I'm on,
right.
Georgia has an amazing visa, by the way. I'm on a 1-year visa free, like visa. It's a 1-year visa free. All you have to do to renew it is exit the country and then re-enter, and it just renews for another year. And they're totally fine if you work on it, as long as you pay taxes. And taxes are just 1% of what you
Wow.
make or your business revenue if you have a business. So yes. And they didn't ask for like my ID, my passport, a residency. They didn't ask for my insurance, nothing. It was just free. And I say to people, I'm like, if Georgia can do that, why can't the wealthiest nation on earth?
When you think about that, just when you said they're going to send an ambulance, my mind went to money immediately. I was like, oh my gosh. And like, that would have given me probably more heart issues because I would have been thinking about the money. And you think about how many Americans don't seek healthcare out of fear. Like, I know friends who go get dental work in another country, and I'm never shocked because when you look at the cost of like what it takes in the US, and then and I've seen some beautiful dental work out of multiple different countries. So that
go to Vietnam, dental cleaning is $4.
I know. I'm gonna get a new cap. I'm telling all my business, but I told my husband once we're in, like, once we get a location, I'm gonna go to Vietnam to get teeth done because I'm like, I've seen beautiful work. But that's a good story to kind of illustrate that yes, you could have a healthy life, not just like, hey, I'm surviving over here, but really a life that maybe changes the quality of life you're having by moving abroad. That's a good story.
I found out I was pregnant, just quickly aside, I found out that I was pregnant while I was visiting family in the US, and I like wanted that initial doctor's appointment, but I couldn't get one. I even tried Planned Parenthood, and they were like, oh, are you a California resident? Like, you can get it for free if you're on Medi-Cal. And I'm like, I don't know, I'm not a California resident. And they're like, oh, well, we can't help you then. And so I could not have a doctor's appointment to like verify that my pregnancy was viable, that the baby was alive. I couldn't have anything.
Should I fly? Is there anything I should know? Yeah.
No, I was where I was like, how do I even, like, how much is it going to cost? Eventually I found an x-ray technician that I could pay out of pocket that people would do like for fun ultrasounds at, like, with a couch and like a big projector. And that was all I got. And she was even telling me crazy stories about people, where she tell people, you have to go to the hospital, and they're like, I can't afford it. Or people going to Mexico for their prenatal appointments because they couldn't afford it because it was Southern California. So yeah, it's crazy.
They want people to have more kids in the U.S. They're just lots of articles about people having kids. I'm like, babies, $1,000 for daycare. The average medium home price is $400,000, which means on average you're going to need 2 incomes. That's if you're debt free. Like, you start doing the math, and I'm like, you're making it very challenging to have a family here. And to your point, I think there's definitely things we could do to make this country so much more welcoming to families. Like, how do we make that more sustainable? All right, so we'll get into rapid fire questions. These are just fun, like they don't hold any relevance.
I'm like only mildly nervous. Oh my God.
You don't mean anything. It's not an anagram about who you are. So if you could go anywhere for a vacation, you're not living there, but what's somewhere that just rents space in your head? Like, I would love to go back there with my baby or my husband on vacation.
Ooh, okay. With husband and baby, I'm going to Japan later this year, like very excited for that. If I were to be like backpacking solo, maybe the Philippines, like I love that. But one thing that I've always wanted to do is go on a horseback riding trek in Inner Mongolia.
Oh, wow.
That's like always been on my bucket list.
You're like, I love that. My mom lived in the Philippines for a few years. She did call center work and loved it. And she loved the Philippines. She talks all the time that she would just go back there and stay. And just experience.
So good for like kind of getting a little, there's so many islands to explore. Like if you get a little off the beaten path, like and you're backpacking, you don't have a lot of money. Amazing.
Having that one. And then if you could work with any brand, you do a ton of travel, you're all over. If you could work with any brand and kind of even partner with your business, who would you pick?
Okay. I don't know if this is a specific brand. I mean, maybe, okay. What I would love to do is if I could sort of coach people on moving abroad or talk about living abroad or life overseas, like on a TV show. That
Mm.
would be so cool. I think,
Ooh,
like
ooh.
Discovery Channel or something, Netflix, something like that, where I could kind of, show, like, really show people and talk about like what it's really like. I was on an episode of House Hunters International, and that was fun. But I think like to do it more in depth, if that makes sense, because 30 minutes is just not enough to
Yeah, to
cover
have like a
everything.
dog. People are like, we're moving, even House Hunters International, they're like, we're moving overseas. And I'm like, how did you do that? What is your
Yes,
job?
yeah, it's way too. I mean, I was on an episode and they filmed us for like a week straight, and then it's 30 minutes, and that includes the house hunting and the cultural stuff. I did like a whole cooking class, and they didn't even put it on there. I was like,
See, and then like, what is your job? Because it's always like, oh, I'm a yoga instructor, makes $300,000 a year. I'm like, what kind of yoga instructor? I'm always amazed by the jobs on House Hunters,
yeah.
both
It's like,
international.
anyway, then let's look at this house. It's like, okay.
How'd you get here? Right. What are your favorite content sources? Like, where do you, and you travel, so I don't know if you use a VPN when you're trying to like, but what are your favorite content sources? Like Netflix or Hulu or TikTok, YouTube?
Oh, okay. Well, in terms of like content sources, as in Netflix and watching TV, my husband, he's all into the streaming and like
Yeah.
which show is on where, so I just trust him. But what we do is we use a Fire Stick, and then we put, hopefully nobody comes after me for this, but we put a VPN on it. We put
Yeah.
ExpressVPN on it, and then we can trick our Fire Stick into thinking that we're in the US, so we can watch we can watch shows that like aren't available outside the US.
Not a lot. Even when people travel, they'll put one on there, like VPN on their thing.
Yeah. And I think for myself, like for my business, I use a lot of Instagram, but for funsies, I scroll TikTok a little too much. I'm trying to cut back on it. But it is so great for learning more about like other countries and traveling and life abroad and what it's like. So I want to get into making some stuff. It's more just like, it's a whole thing that I have to get into.
Well, it's a different vibe in terms of creating content, so I feel you on
Busy.
that. I know, you're like,
Yeah,
I'm mom now. I got things to do.
yeah, but it's like, let me show you about my, my life in South Korea, and like, here's my apartment, and and I'm like, I love watching other people. I love seeing that kind of stuff, and I think it's really helpful for other people who want to live abroad to actually see what it's like. And I remember back when travel Snapchat was a thing, which I did it back in the day before we realized it was very hard for other people to find you. But it made me less nervous to travel to certain countries that might have been intimidating to me, because I'd see somebody being like, okay, so, this is me in this country, and here's what I'm doing, and here's where I'm staying. And I'm like, oh, awesome. Like, that's great information to know.
I love that.
Yeah.
Same. I'll watch tons of YouTube vlogs on like where people travel. If you had to devote your life to one kind of philanthropic effort, so something that's your way of giving back, especially after seeing, being all around the globe and kind of seeing different, all the different ways you could help if you had that kind of finances or will, what would you give back? What's your kind of area?
Well, there's the ones that I should do, and then there's the one that I might actually do. So I'll give you the one that I might actually do, even though there's ones that I think might be a better spent of my money, or like I quote unquote should. I'm just really passionate. I love cats, and I'm just like really passionate about animals in general. And so when I lived in Vietnam, I would foster street cats with the local cat shelter, and it was also a cat cafe that was like a jungle with 100 cats. It's crazy. So I would foster cats that were abandoned, like thrown in the trash, or like tied up on the side of the road in plastic bags. Here in Tbilisi, I have 2 street cat rescues, one of which has a lot of medical issues, so that's been fun taking care of her. But I think it would be so cool one day to open like a rescue cat cafe in an area that really needs it, like an area with a lot of like street cats and animals that really need that help, just because I am so passionate about animals. And it could be like a fun experience where people could donate to get the animals on the street like spayed and neutered, and like you could I could arrange like foster placements and adoptions. And I think if I just like was good in terms of money and I had some time, that would be something that I'd love to start. Just for
everywhere
fun.
when you travel, I see like and I'm like, I can't decide if you belong to someone. Like I do see that a lot where you hear about animal rescue. Our friends had done some of that in another country. They were helping rehome animals across the globe. And it was crazy to see the impact they were having, but also how expensive it is. It was very expensive to get them rehomed. All right. And very last question. Would your 12-year-old self think you were cool?
I think so. Honestly, like, I kind of live my life in a way. I think 12-year-old self thinking that you're cool is a good one. Another one is I think, like, I want my grandkids to think that I'm cool if I end up having grandkids. No pressure on my daughters to have kids. But like, if I were to have grandkids, I would want them to be like, wow, my grandma was so cool. Like, what did she do? Like, wow. And but I think, like, as a little kid, I was the weirdo who would read. My family had like a children's encyclopedia with pictures, right? And I would look through, and I would look at the foods and be like, I wonder what those taste like, or like, I wonder what it would be like to be in that country. And so in order, like, if I went back in time and talked to my 12-year-old self, and I'm like, yeah, so I've been living abroad for 11 years. I live in this country now that you've never even heard of. I lived in China and I speak Mandarin and I did this. And I think my 12-year-old self would be like, what?
You are incredible. The best life we were given. I agree. I think I have a 13-year-old. I think he would think you were very cool. So all right. Well, tell everyone how they can find you. I know this is a resource that a lot of people are looking for. I too have been like, where do I even start? So how does everyone get a hold of you? What's the best way to learn more?
Sure. So one easy way to get a hold of me, I'm just Move Abroad Coach on everything, like Move Abroad Coach on Instagram and Facebook, and also I have the Move Abroad Coach podcast. But if you're really wanting to get started, I do have something very exciting coming up in a couple of days. So if you're listening to this live, so you know how earlier I was talking about how I work with people to create their own personalized Move Abroad plans. We've got to figure out what kind of lifestyle you want, where you're going to move and what kind of visa you need, how you're going to make money. And then we need to make sure all the pieces work together. I have a live boot camp coming up this weekend. So it's an intensive 4-day boot camp where we do an hour-long training each day. But I pop in daily with like mindset Facebook Lives. I've got bonus trainings on healthcare and health insurance, medications, and moving abroad with your pets, and starting a business that allows you to move abroad. So if you're interested, a ticket is only $37 for this whole boot camp. And it's going to be awesome. We usually have a couple hundred people come live, so you can surround yourself with other people who also really want to move abroad and have this lifestyle. So if you just go to, it's called the Move Abroad Escape Plan Bootcamp. So if you just go to escapeplanbootcamp.com, you can grab a ticket, and we start on Saturday the 17th. In case you're not listening to this live.
A year from now, you missed it, but still reach out. I'm sure there'll be more great things happening. The episode will be live, so for those of you who hear it right away, you'll get to jump on it. Well, I love it. I will make sure to send lots of folks your way to just help navigate how to move abroad and experience it. It was absolutely delightful having you as a guest. I think you answered a lot of things that come to mind for me immediately when I think about how would I navigate that, and even as I fully look into retiring outside the country, like things to think about just from that place. So thank you so much for being a guest. I recommend everyone reach out and kind of get to know the Move Abroad Coach. And then congratulations on your beautiful baby.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. This has been such a fun conversation. And I got to talk about or touch on a lot of topics that I don't always get to talk about. So that was fun.
Dig around.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. And then so much more to come from you. Take care.
Awesome.